I would like to introduce Laurie Beavis, who is presenting our next paper. Laurie is a PhD candidate in art education at Concordia University, Montreal. Her nearly completed, oh, I remember this so well, dissertation examines the intersection of cultural identity and art experiences across the lifetime of 4 contemporary First Nations women artists. The question of cultural identity and its connection to education, and particularly art, originated with exploring the history and experiences of her mother and grandmother at the on-reserve school at Hiawatha First Nation on Rice Lake near Peterborough, Ontario. Laurie's first major curatorial project, The Rebel Yells, Dress and Political Redress in Contemporary Indigenous Art, is currently on exhibition at the FOFA Gallery, Concordia University until May 29th, 2015. Take it away, Laurie.
Good morning. Thank you, Sherry, and thank you for inviting me. Today I'm discussing the publicity photographs as a way to enter into a discussion of self-representation of 2 Haudenosaunee women working at the beginning of the 20th century. Pauline Johnson was from 6 Nations and appeared on stage as a professional poet and dramatic orator in theaters in Canada, the United States, and England. The other, Esther from Akwesasne, gained success as a dancer in Europe and on the Broadway vaudeville stage. According to Deloria from 2004, when Native people are found outside of expected situations, I'm going to just move. There they are. Such as in modern setting like a theater, they have been seen as both an anomaly and an exceptional. To counter this attitude, he suggests we need to revisit the actions and ask why they occurred, rethink the history of expectations, and reinterpret the framework of colonial expectations. Similarly, McNelly and Nixon Phillips, in their study of Wild West show Native performers, state that our understanding of the performers needs to be complicated rather than continuing to present the performers as disadvantaged and powerless. We need to examine where and how they expressed agency in their work and imagery. To revisit and reinterpret the actions of Pauline, Dega Ionwega Johnson, and Esther, Princess White Deer, I would like to read their publicity photographs as evidence of how they, as theater-based artists, mediated their identity through promotional material. I propose to examine how they represented themselves, their work, and their identity as Aboriginal, modern, and professional. I contend that through their self-promotion images, they actively cultivated themselves as subjects in front of the camera, playing on their femininity and exotic appeal, but at the same time remaining firmly in control of their own images and presenting themselves as self-possessed and independent Indigenous women of the early 20th century. The first question I must answer is, how did these women choose entertainment as a venue to make their livelihood, and how did they configure their identity as Native women and as performers? After her father's death in 1884, Pauline Johnson, her sister Evelyn, and their mother were all left to live a modest life. Johnson, in the spirit of impoverished gentlewomen of the late 19th century, began to write and publish her poetry. She soon began to think of herself as a professional poet with great ambitions. In 1890, she wrote to a friend, "I am willing to consent to anything legitimate. That will mean success in the end." In the same letter, she also expressed other motivations. "In all my work and strivings, my objectives are to," that's my quote, my interjection, "to upset the Indian extermination and non-education theory, to stand by my blood and my race, and secondly, to see something of the great world, and to do this, one must work." Pauline Johnson was born in 1861 at 6 Nations in Upper Canada. As the child of a mixed marriage, Johnson negotiated her mixed race identity throughout her life. Excuse me. Her mother, Emily Howells, was a British immigrant from a Quaker family, and they came to the U.S. or to Canada and the U.S. to work against this abolitionist movement. While her father, George Johnson, was a hereditary Haudenosaunee chief of the Wolf clan and member of a historically entitled family. As Gray noted, mixed marriages weren't unheard of on the reserve or elsewhere, but most involved European men and Native women. As we can imagine, the marriage between Johnson and Howells drew both attention and disapproval. As mentioned earlier, Johnson's father died young, and as a result, Pauline, Evelyn, and their mother left their home at Six Nations. From that time to survive financially, both the sisters were required to make their own livelihood. From early adulthood, Johnson considered herself a new woman and aligned herself with the bohemian world. She was drawn to the spotlight in order to make a career, and from 1880 onwards, she began to have some success in publishing her poetry. By 1890, she had over 60 poems published in various periodicals. From the beginning, her female identity was unconditional, but her native heritage in this period was known only to a few. However, this began to change in 1892. That year, Johnson was invited to perform at a literary evening, and she presented A Cry from an Indian Wife, a poem from 1885. The poem illustrates the mistreatment of prairie tribes during the Second Northwest Rebellion. From that evening on, both her mixed identity and her allegiance to her paternal heritage came forward. Johnson recognized the great potential of the crowd's reaction and quickly acted upon the enthusiasm that was generated. Gerson and Strongbow state that the combination of an attractive performer and liberal guilt over the repression of Indigenous people was a tantalizing combination that was from this point, and it was from this point that Johnson positioned herself as woman native. These authors also state that right from the start of her stage career, Johnson asserted control over both her art and her performance. As she performed her dual heritage in her poetry and dramatic readings, Johnson was soon consciously made a decision to promote herself as Dega Ionwega, the Mohawk poetess. In doing so, she realized that it was incompatible to be dressed as a late Victorian gentlewoman reciting poems about fearless Indian women and warriors. Therefore, Johnson decided that for one act, she would adopt a romanticized version of native clothing, and in the second act, she would appear in Victorian evening dress. According to Gray, to achieve her look, Johnson mail-ordered an outfit from the Hudson's Bay Company. The dress came with moccasins and a beaded belt adorned with moose hair and porcupine quills, to which she added rabbit pelts, her Haudenosaunee grandmother's silver trade brooches, her father's hunting knife, and a Huron scalp belonging to her grandfather. In the promotional images dating from 1892 to 1906, we find Johnson dressed in her native clothing or Victorian evening wear. The poses in her native garb are dramatic and show her both strength and evoke both strength and pride in her family heritage. And that's her. And then for Esther Deer, entertainment was a family business. Motivated by economics, as there were limited ways to make a living on the reserve, Deer's father and uncle formed their own trick riding act. Then in their own and other professional troupes, they performed from the 1890s onwards. From childhood, Deer was part of and trained in the Wild West shows with her family. She traveled extensively with her family through Europe from about the age of 10 years, and by her 20s, she was an entertainer in her own right. Like Johnson, Esther Deer, Princess White Deer, was a performer who hoped to play a transformative role while entertaining vaudeville and nightclub audiences in New York City from the 1910s into the 1930s. Born at Akwesasne, straddling the Canadian-U.S. border, Deer began performing in her family show, The Deer Family, Indians of the Past, at an early age. She was born in, sorry, I didn't say this, but she was born in circa 1891, and so by about the age of 9 or 10, she and her family joined Texas Jack's Wild West show, and they went on a tour of South Africa. So that was her first trip out of Canada. After this tour, the Deer family remained in Europe, performing in Great Britain and on the continent from late 1904 to 1910, with Esther as Little Deer, participating as a dancer, singer, and in dramatic roles. As part of the family troupe and on her own, she then traveled and performed in Europe in the decade leading to World War I. But by 1917, as Princess White Deer, she was in New York City working in vaudeville and engaged as a performer in patriotic war work. Throughout her career, Deer took pride in being billed as a bright example of genuine Americanism, a trope that she continue to use both in terms of her career and as an avenue to help further Indigenous political and social causes. She continued to promote Native American causes throughout her long life, many of which were aimed at recognition of the ongoing participation of Natives in American culture, as well as the cultural heritage of American Indians. The preservation of Native identity through art, music, and dance was one of her goals in her own theatrical stagings. In her transition from Wild West shows to vaudeville, Dear moved from broad spectacle to a feminized theatrical performance, and as she was associated with both the Keith Albee and the Ziegfeld theater circuits, the persona of Princess played into both the impresario's objective of gentrifying the theater and into Dear's own objective of playing with the power and duality of her role as entertainer and exploring the possibilities and realities of her dual existence as Native and modern. In one production, From Wigwam to White Lights, Dear traced an arc from early tribal dancers to modern jazz dance, and she also adopted blackness and other exotic costuming. I've lost my place. And poses in her dances, and then in quick costume change, she became a coy American girl in a sunbonnet. This is a advertisement from it was a midweek pictorial, was from the New York Times, and published on Wednesdays, and she got a center spread. And there she is. I think she looks a bit like Superman there. And then, as I say, in one quick turn, she would, with a costume turn, she became a coy American girl in a sunbonnet. In this way, the stereotypes became disguises as much as the other fictional adoption of the moniker of princess. While we do not have Dear's actual words to verify what she thought about the costumes, we do have the diary entries of her slightly younger contemporary, Molly Spotted Elk Nelson, who wrote of both her pleasure in being able to perform authentic dances and parodied herself as the jumpin' Indian in a skimpy costume that did not do justice to her dances. Nevertheless, Nixon Phillips believed the evidence points to Dear making choices that were self-conscious and strategic and enabled her to convey the message that she and her male dancers were present in the 20th century, both in body and in a completely modern situation, the vaudeville theater, and as such in control of their own identity. Nixon Phillips also recounts that Dear made it impossible for her audience not to recognize her doubleness in their use of costumes, masks, and Indian stereotypes. As we can see in the publicity stills, Dear appears to acknowledge the 1920s modernist vogue for primitivism by playing with the signs and objects of Indigenous culture, for example, the feathered headdress, the beadwork patterning, and especially the false face mask. What role do the promotional images play in helping us understand how these two women were representing themselves? I say that there are three aspects to the question. The first is they help us to rethink the position of the Native body and its placement in time and space. For example, I'll catch up with myself here. For example, in Edward Curtis's images, he captured the Native Americans also dating from the early 20th century, and they are a stark contrast to Johnson and Dear's promotional images. It is well known that Curtis removed all traces of Western material culture from the usually staged scenes, as his intention was to photograph the natives before they vanished and to situate them in a pre-modern space untouched by Western society. In contrast, Johnson and Dear promoted their careers as in contemporary venues, using their promotional images on signage and in newspapers. They were photographed in both their buckskin dresses and in modern dress. One description of promotional image is a little picture with the promise of something more. In this context, as a tool of advertising at the beginning of the 20th century, they can also be seen as a microcosm of the bigger, more complicated spaces such as emerging urbanism, growth of immigrant populations, and women's participation in public life. Johnson and Dear are a case in point, as they saw themselves as modern new women who traveled autonomously, lived independently, and made their own living. The second part of the question is they mediated their identity as modern and indigenous and turned the image of the native back onto the colonial gazer. For Dear, playing on the role of the Indian princess meant that she could exploit modern notions of the native woman. She consistently conflated present-day vaudeville with her knowledge of indigenous dance. She also brought her knowledge of dance from other cultures into her stage act. Throughout her career, Dear took every opportunity to promote a broader understanding of Native art, music, and dance, both on and off the stage. Despite the fact that her stage performances were staged as spectacles for a mostly white audience, she was still very keen to ensure that in her position as a choreographer-dancer, the dances would be authentically and accurately performed. In her publicity photographs, she continuously calls her identity into question. She takes on different personas and costumes, dressing in Orientalist costume, modern dress, or as the all-American girl. She also adopted dramatic poses and juxtaposed her modern face with a mask. In doing so, she suggests that she was repetitively both claiming and calling into question her own identity as a modern woman. I would also like to mention that her use of the stereotypical costumes, such as the plains headdress, as Baba contends, mimicry is evident in Dear's use of stereotypical representation of Native material culture. For Baba, this means the device becomes an effective strategy to critique colonial knowledge. Dear is conflating past and present and using the most recognizable prop of pan-Indian culture. At the same time, she is making a nod to both colonial desire and a recognition that the tiny buckskin shorts and the trailing feathered headdress bring past and present together and are part of the artifice that is a requirement of the vaudeville stage and part of the spectacle and showmanship of the venue. All lessons learned in her early childhood experience of the Wild West shows. Similarly, for Johnson and her buckskin dress, the dress was part of the process of registering the stereotypical image with the object and then repeating the image back to the colonial spectator. As Baba states, it is in the in-between spaces and slippages that allow for subversion and negotiation. By 1892, Johnson knew there was no such thing as a traditional and extant Mohawk woman's dress. She had mail-ordered her dress from the Hudson's Bay Company. Nevertheless, she understood that the buckskin dress that she wore on stage and in her publicity stills was the indicator of Indian to prospective audiences. Through her poetry, book covers, and promotional images, Johnson was constantly negotiating a space for herself in modern-day Canada, and by extension, a place within that society for Indigenous Canadians. The third aspect of the question is they used the images to cultivate themselves. Let's see what's next here. She's using her, and there's both of them. They used the images to cultivate themselves as subjects in control of their identity. Neither of the women questioned their Native identity, even as they manipulated it. Johnson played with her mixed heritage and insisted on its recognition. Moving back and forth or blurring her Haudenosaunee and English heritage was an important element for her, despite doing this at a time when great emphasis was placed on racial identity. The interesting thing is Johnson crossed the racial boundary at will, moving from Native other to Imperial I with the change of her dress. But what is more startling is that once she had passed from Native to Euro-Canadian, she willingly returned and as such continually confounded the simple dichotomies of the Western consciousness. Dear, too, confounded those dichotomies. As McNenly states, Dear controlled how she was identified, and as an important facet of this was drawing on both an American and Native identity. This duality was often highlighted in the press and was meant to and did appeal to audiences. Press clippings often mentioned her duality, her patriotism, and how she seamlessly moved back and forth in the context of her dances from Indigenous to modern. Another seeming contradiction for Dear was the fact that as a Native woman, she had a long and successful career. She was always in control of her career, and in time she became a successful businesswoman, owning a nightclub, a drugstore, and her own home in Upper New York State. She also negotiated with government officials and politicians. In doing so, she activated a space for both herself and the Native and white worlds. Like Deloria, McNenly suggests that in examining the narrative or the archival image, we need to rethink or reread the images from a non-Western perspective in order to gain access to the Indigenous voice. McNenly also states that we need to look for new meanings and interpretations to step away from imposed stereotypical readings. For this reason, she turned to the notion of the contact zone as a space of colonial encounter, albeit often unequal, nevertheless suggesting that there is a possibility for agency in such a space in terms of intention as a cultural project and in the relationships constituted between the subjects. In McNenly's view, the performers participate in for their own reasons, and in doing so, create their own autoethnographic expression. I believe that Johnson and Deere fit this criteria. They had agency in their career choices, they produced their own identity in the context of their performances, and this followed through into their public images. They created an autoethnography that insisted on their origins as Mohawk, and they situated themselves in the public realm as modern women, and in doing so worked towards challenging dominant images of the Native. As Nafo stated, through self-representation, a profound dialogue can develop between women and their culture. The woman can take back what has always belonged to her by altering the context, and through using imagery as self-promotion or as a creative response, she can redefine her identity and place in the world. Thank you.